Hello, everyone. I'm just going to get us started so that we can hear from our wonderful panelists. So thank you all so much for attending the first panel as part of our Dissemination and Implementation Science speaker series. I want to briefly introduce myself, the broader goal of the speaker series, and the esteemed panelists that we have with us today. So my name is Brianna Last, and I'm an assistant professor in the clinical area of the psychology department at Stony Brook University. And I organized this speaker series with the help of Dr. Joanne Davila, who's also at Stony Brook University, as well as the fantastic members of my lab. So special thanks to Laura and Madeline, who've played enormous roles in organizing this series. So the Dissemination and Implementation Science Training Series is part of a project funded and supported by the Academy of Psychological Clinical Science. The overall goal of the project is to strengthen dissemination and implementation science training across clinical psychology training programs. So as population mental health challenges have become more pressing across the country and around the world, there's a real need to ensure that people can easily access high-quality, evidence-based mental health services. The question of how to meet this need is one that dissemination and implementation scientists have really tried to answer. And since its inception, the field of dissemination and implementation science has developed unique methods, theoretical frameworks, and models that can help move the needle on population mental health and ensure that people get the support that they need. But training in dissemination and implementation science is not widely available in clinical psychology science programs. So the purpose of our project is to leverage the immense capacities, expertise, and resources in already existing clinical psychology science programs to spread this knowledge to trainees. By making this speaker series free and virtual, we hope that it can support everyone who's interested in learning about dissemination and implementation science. So today's panel is called Redesigning for Implementation, and it features esteemed panelists, Dr. Bruce Chorpita and Dr. Lyon. Sarah Kate Bierman was originally supposed to be our third panelist, but she had a last-minute emergency that she needed to attend to. We are very sad to miss Sarah Kate, but feel glad that she can be with family. And this will still be a spectacular panel with our visionary panelists, Bruce and Erin. So you might be wondering what we mean by designing or redesigning for implementation. Well, if we think about traditional conceptualizations of the translational pipeline of scientific innovations, the first stage typically involves establishing the internal validity of interventions in efficacy trials. The second stage involves testing intervention effectiveness in real-world settings. And then finally, the third stage involves testing implementation outcomes. This prolonged process may explain why more than half of implementation efforts are unsuccessful when they're finally implemented in the community. Bruce and Erin have both been visionaries in our field in rethinking and reimagining what this translational pipeline can look like. Our esteemed panelists have conducted research that considers implementation from the very beginning of intervention development at the design and sometimes redesign stage. And I'm so delighted to have them both here and for you all to hear about their groundbreaking scholarship. So let me briefly introduce them and then have them take it away. So Bruce Chorpita is a professor in the Department of Psychology and the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at the University of California, Los Angeles. Bruce has dedicated his career to improving the effectiveness of mental health services delivered to youth and their families. Bruce has held a variety of positions in academia and government leadership. In particular, from 2001 to 2003, he served as the clinical director of the Hawaii Department of Health's Child and Adolescent Mental Health Division, where he led a reform initiative that doubled the effect size and cost effectiveness of mental health outcomes for all youth served by the state system. He's also the lead author of the MATCH ADTC protocol, an evidence-based treatment that outperformed multiple other evidence-based treatments in 2 randomized effectiveness trials in 3 different states. Welcome, Bruce. Erin Lyon is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Washington and director of the SMART Center. He also co-directs the UW Alacrity Center and directs the Research Institute for Implementation Science and Education. Lots of directing. His research focuses on increasing the accessibility, efficiency, and effectiveness of community and school-based interventions for children, adolescents, and families. And he's particularly interested in the identification and implementation of low-cost, high-yield mental health practices, development of individual and organizational implementation strategies to promote adoption and sustainment of evidence-based practices, and human-centered design and redesign of psychosocial and digital technologies to improve their implementability, accessibility, and effectiveness. So welcome, Erin. So just in terms of the structure of our talk, of our panel rather, each panelist is going to speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period. I'm going to begin the question and answer period with some of my own questions before opening it up to the audience. So if you could please hold your questions until that period, till the end, just so that you can all be engaged in the talks. And I also just want to point out that if you should experience any technical difficulties or have questions about the administration or logistics of the panel, you can write to Laura Jans. Laura, if you could just wave your hand, and Madeline Poupard. Laura and Madeline will both be sort of assisting in terms of all of the technical facets of the panel. And also, if you somehow get kicked off the Zoom call, have no fear. Just email the dissemination.implementation@gmail.com email address, and we'll make sure to assist you, and we'll be monitoring the email during the talk. Okay, without further ado, let's just begin with our first panelists. And Bruce, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Brianna. And I'm going to start my timer so I can stick to your 20 to 30 minute time frame here. So I'm looking at the guest list, and speaking of redesigning, this is like a who's who of experts that make me think we should redesign it and have most of you talk, and I should be listening. When I'm looking at all the names here, I'm thinking, wow, this is quite a gathering. So thank you all for taking time out of the day in the middle of a Wednesday here. I'll do the best I can to talk a bit about design from my perspective and see if that makes sense to folks. Let me share screen here so I can get my first thing up. And if that looks bad, yeah, oh, that looks good. I got a thumbs up from Brianna, so I'm doing all right. So first of all, I want to say I'm super grateful that we're starting this whole series talking about design because I really consider myself an apologetic implementation scientist. And by that, I mean, if we design well, there might not be implementation science. And so I'm going to just sort of cross that out for a moment and say, if we're designing, we might not have to think about implementation at all. Most of us wear a wristwatch to know what time it is. And that's a testament to how well designed they are and how well they do what they do. Most of us carry mobile phones. No one had to do big studies to figure out how to convince people to go out and get one. Once you saw one, you said, I want one of those. How do I get one? And we line up and we get new ones all the time, right? So if we design well, the implementation science burden goes way down. And I think we spend a lot more time trying to implement things that are poorly designed than we do designing. So that's why I'm glad to have Aaron here too. I can't wait to hear what he says. I think this is a big opportunity for our field to put a lot more thought into what we're doing. Quick acknowledgements. These are most of my funders over the last 25, 30 years. I'm also a co-founder of PracticeWise that will come up throughout the talk. So that's another one of my hats that I've been wearing over the last 20 years or so in industry as part of trying to design things to scale and so forth. So that'll come up a little bit too. So I want to start off with quotes from my three design heroes. So we're going to start with three quotes just to get us rolling here. The first one is from Herb Simon, who says that everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. So we're all designers, and anyone trying to make anything better, whether it's clean up your house, whether it's find a better way to get to your office when you're commuting. I'm trying to find a better route. You're designing something, right? So we're always designing when we're trying to change a situation. And this is what humans do. We create artifacts. We make things all the time. We're always designing. And so we need to think of ourselves always as designers. Second quote here is from Steve Jobs, who says that most people make the mistake of thinking design is what something looks like, but it's not just what it looks and feels like. Design is how something works. So he very nicely reminds us that interface is good for getting us to look at something, getting attention. It's shiny. But how something works determines whether we keep using it. And any of you who have a smartphone, you know what a great design genius Steve Jobs was. And then finally, this is probably one of my favorites. It's hard to pick a favorite here, but Don Norman, who works right down the road still, says, most accidents are caused by human error. How is it that so many people are incompetent? Answer, they aren't. It's a design problem. Right. So, and, if you know Don Norman, he's famous for what's called the Norman door, which is these doors that have ambiguous signifiers, right? They have a pull handle and a push sign. And if you've ever yanked one of these and had your shoulder hurt and suddenly people are staring at you and you feel embarrassed, you know what it feels like to be a mental health provider using a treatment protocol that doesn't feel like it fits, right? So we need to think the way Don Norman thinks, which is if something's not fitting, it might be the engineer's problem and not the user's problem. I love his position that we never blame the user. We can always design better. All right, so with that for context, I'm going to try to answer 3 questions in 20 minutes. Let's see how I do. The first is really just backing up to what are we designing? Because I don't even think we ask ourselves that question. I heard Brianna say we're designing interventions. So I'm going to push back on that a little bit and say, it starts that way. It seems simple enough that here's an intervention. There's a direct service provider collaborating with a youth and family member to improve their lives in some way. And they're providing some kind of practices, presumably, and they're getting some feedback on how they're doing, like how's the progress? Are you feeling better? And would you prefer to do this or that, right? So there's this interchange that we call therapy, and that's maybe what we're designing. Seems pretty simple, right? Well, we all know we typically manage the quality of that service through supervision and consultation. And we do more than case guidance. We actually provide professional development as supervisors, right? So how is a therapist developing and getting better at what they do? And we provide emotional support when we need to. And the direct service provider typically feeds back some kind of performance metrics of what do they know, what are they learning, what are they doing, are their cases getting better, and their preferences, where do they want to go next, what do they want to learn next, and things like that. That tends to get bundled in our field into a program, like how all those operations go together tend to be what define a program. And although we codify the practices part in a manual, typically when you do an RCT on a manual, you're really controlling all of these different parts, how we measure, how we supervise, and how we practice, and so forth. Now, in a mental health system, one program is never enough to serve all of the different types of youth challenges that you serve. So we typically stack a bunch of these together. Some of them are transdiagnostic, or they're flexible in ways that can meet many different kinds of kids, but there is not a single community mental health system I've ever encountered that has implemented a single program that works for everybody. I've never seen that yet. Maybe it's aspirational, but anyway, so we have multiple programs working together. And then in a system, whether it's formal in a community government system, or whether it's in a service organization, there are these various functions that go around supporting these programs. Revenue and contract management. How are we going to pay for these things? Who are we going to pay? How much should we pay? Performance management. Is this program being done correctly and properly and at a high level of quality? The training and development section that says, how do we create a workforce that can deliver these programs? Do we have the right people with the right training? How do we hire those people? And then utilization management to say, do we have enough capacity so there's not a wait list? Are we underserving certain people? Have we overtrained in certain areas and undertrained in others? And we need to communicate back to the training division or the contract division and so forth. So there's you see all these arrows, right, of all this interchange among various functions in the system to get these programs to be operating successfully. This happens in the context of a policy environment that's usually evolving and interacting with systems. And that further is interacting with an external environment that has to summarize the world's knowledge about what's happening in science, what do we know about what's happening in the world, and what is the policy environment, the macro environment, right? So things like, what are policymakers and legislators doing? What are professors telling us these days? And what are publishers giving us to look at and read? We may interface with external organizations like universities or centers for excellence or training academies to outsource some of these functions. So the point here is there's a very large collaboration of many, many different types of individuals to get these programs to work in actual life, right? In real life. And we as designers, so back to the what are we designing? We as designers are often thinking about the little piece that we're making down in our little foxhole. So it might be things like a manual that says, what are the practices down there? Or in the upper left, that orange, we're making a dashboard to figure out what are the progress, how do we display the progress a youth is making? Or a learning record to reflect what does this provider know how to do, whether it's certificates or credentials of some kind or some other learning history, so the supervisor knows what does this therapist know how to do. And there might be some kind of guidance or protocol someone develops for the supervisor to supervise in ways that follow best practice. So we might be designing these little orange boxes, right? But there's many, many of these things going on. There's train the trainer protocols, and there's waitlist reports that have to be designed for utilization managers, and practice guidelines and lit reviews from academics, right? And budgets that come down from the government, and fidelity measures for performance management to deploy, and so on and so forth. So there are lots of little orange boxes here that we have to think about that are getting designed. And so my takeaway number one with this, what are we designing? We're designing lots of things, but I want to focus people on, we need to design things that work. And we often focus on the little orange box we're working on. But more importantly, we need to design things that work together. And there's two kinds of corollaries here to think about. One is that if you don't understand the context into which you're going to drop your little orange box, you're going to be in trouble, because your practices on your manual are going to have to get picked up by a dashboard or some other progress measurement system. And the quality control by the performance management section is going to have to know what are the practices, right? So your piece is going to spill into all these other moving parts of a system. And if you don't see how that's all going to fit together, or you don't make it in a way that's extensible, that can generalize to those contexts, you may encounter difficulties. And the second thing here is, I think coordination is a role unto itself. So in other words, designing these parts, the little orange boxes, that's one type of design. But organizing the entire array of orange boxes and functions and people and communication channels is another design task unto itself. I think it's an unappreciated one. It's probably one of the least attended to aspects of design, I think, in our field, is how we coordinate all the different things. We're good at making lots of little things. We're not so good at organizing how they all work together. And just like you can have 100 excellent musicians playing terrible chaos without a good composer and a good conductor, we can have the same kinds of chaos in mental health systems if we don't have someone designing how they all play together. So that's my takeaway number one. We're designing lots of things, and they all have to work together. So question 2 of 3, how should we design? And you see I have these 3 Ds down at the bottom. So I'm going to talk about this issue of 3 Ds. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before, so apologies. Diversity is the first of the Ds I want to mention. So people are diverse in so many different ways. And I'm going to talk about one way by talking about my family members. So I have my younger daughter, I have 2 daughters. My younger daughter would love to control our home entertainment center using that thing on the top, which has many, many buttons. And we can't watch a show without her making adjustments to various things and clicking things too. And playing with the sound, loves audio stuff, whatever, just way, way into it. My father, on the other hand, would like to have the thing at the bottom of this picture, which is an on-off switch, and that's it. Doesn't want to tinker, doesn't like remote controls, and so forth. In these two ways, my family has that type of diversity, right? And of course, it's a contrived example. We are diverse. We have different values. We have different beliefs, cultures, preferences in many, many, many ways. And the point is, of this example, neither of them is right or wrong. Although sometimes I think they're wrong. I would like an intermediate level of buttons personally. But the point is, there's really no right or wrong. People are just going to have different preferences for how they want to interact with something that we design. And so if we put this into a clinical science context, we might think about a provider. Provider one, like my younger daughter, likes complexity, wants lots of features, wants lots of handouts, wants something in multiple languages, and has lots of kinds of exception management features and things like that. And provider two wants something that has three things in it, or it's just one procedure and it's transdiagnostic and it's simple. So we have to accommodate for the fact that a workforce may have many, many people, some of whom like mobile applications, some like books, some like working online, and so forth. And we have to design a door or an interface for everybody to bring everybody into the room. The second D stands for diversity. Sorry, for development. The second D stands for development, which means that providers and preferences can change. And so people can change. And so in this example, this provider two, who likes simplicity at first, may decide after a while, hey, you know what? I wish I could adjust this one thing, but my one yellow button doesn't seem to do that. They want more features. Now, this has literally come up for us almost every time I've done implementation in a large system. In the first year, people are like, too many buttons. And then a year in, they say, I'm bored, give me more. I want another layer. I want more features. I want something. And so it's almost always the case that people grow into whatever we build for them, and then they want the more advanced version. I've almost never seen a system where that hasn't happened, where people request the next layer. So provider one naturally is going to want something that looks like this to adjust things, right? Now, clients develop too. They change over time. That's our job, is to get them to change over time. And when we think about a mental health system, you have to think about millions of intersections of clients who are on a pathway of developing and providers who are on a different pathway. And it's at these intersections that we're often trying to design things like manuals and dashboards to figure out, what does this client need to get better today? What does this provider need to meet them where they are, to deliver what they can do to get better at their job, to do it better tomorrow, right? That's a really hard task. And it's hard enough if it wasn't happening in the context of the science changing, right? All of you out there doing research are adding to this problem, because we're moving down a river on a, you know, this dance floor is on a river boat moving down a river, and the context is constantly changing. So what we do at these intersections is never the same twice, right? And that's good. The research is getting better, but we have to think about the fact that everything's changing, everything's moving all the time. And then the third D here, stands for dynamics. And that rings home for me, especially today. And I'll give you a little story in a moment about that. But what we know about dynamics is that it's good to have a plan. And many people go into therapy with a plan, like a therapist, a provider might have a plan. And when that plan fails, we've done lots of research on this. And when the plan fails, providers typically have done one of two things. One is they continue to do plan A because they don't have a plan B, right? And so that's one approach. The other is to improvise. If you don't have a plan B, try to do something. And both of these make sense if you don't have a plan B. But the point of thinking about dynamics in design is that you should never leave someone without a plan B. And that's again, like Don Norman would say, that's on us. That's on the designer to say, I need to build in for the fact that I know there's 5 things that go wrong in therapy almost all the time. And I'm going to build in ways for that to be captured and handled so that nobody's left improvising or just repeating an ineffective plan A. Brianna knows this because I called her an hour ago when I was at my UCLA office, where they started drilling holes in the concrete outside my window. And so this is my plan B. I am home now, but I scrambled to get here and had a second office set up in case something went wrong at my first office. So thank goodness that actually worked. So it was a good living example for me today of designing a plan B in advance so that we don't end up, I don't know what my improvise would have been. Do it from my mobile phone in the car, maybe. So putting this all together, here's an example then of how a treatment episode, that therapy episode for provider two for this client might have a crisis or an engagement problem. What are we going to design to make sure that that gets handled? If we're dealing with trainings and workshops and professional development programs, what about a provider who has a family emergency? Sarah Kate had a family emergency today. People miss things. That's part of life. How do we design professional development, workforce development programs to accommodate the fact that there's always some portion of the workforce that has to be away for some reason, right? So we need to think about that from the beginning and not get frustrated when life goes wrong, because it always does, right? And then getting to tactical issues here, how do we actually do that, right? So we could say these are great strategies, but tactically, we do a lot of what's called use case modeling, which is essentially just designing for scenarios. If you're not familiar with, I suspect many of you experts on this group here are experts, but if you're not and you're curious, we have a nice chapter on it in the National Academy of the Sciences Ontologies book, which you can download. I put the link there. That talks about this ACRES framework that we put in the chapter, and it basically is a template for thinking through a scenario and what could happen in a scenario. And the resource is orange again, because remember, we're building those little orange things. We're building the resources. So we need to think about these other aspects, like maybe my use case is a therapist in a clinic using an assessment measure to determine the eligibility of a youth, and the caregiver is a beneficiary or stakeholder, right? They need to know what's going to happen. And there may be certain constraints about how we do that. To determine eligibility, we might need norms for this measure to make some kind of normative comparison, something like that. Another use case would be a therapist working in a school. You're building a treatment protocol for this scenario. The treatment protocol has the expected goal of improving mood. The stakeholders are youth, teachers, and peers. You have the opportunity for daily contact, but this might have to be brief because summer could be coming up. It can involve peers. It may not be able to include caregivers very easily. So you need to think about the constraints of your context when you're thinking about what it is you're designing. And what I like to think about when we talk about designing treatment protocols is that most of our treatment protocols are built around the use case of a clinical trial, right? So they have 16 sessions. They used to all have like 12 or 16 sessions. Why? Because the use case of a clinical trial says the control group is only allowed to go for 16 weeks. So we have to design something for this. That's not designed for the use case of therapy in the real world, which ends when someone gets better, right? And so different use cases are going to produce different designs, which are going to be suitable for different contexts. And I want to give a shout out to Deborah McGinnis, who's a colleague of mine, who just has been super helpful, a collaborator on a bunch of projects with us. And she tends to think about all these little things we design as knowledge resources. She's a computer scientist, semantic engineer, so she works in semantic web. And it sounds fancy, but it's like a great way to think about the things we build as knowledge resources, which are everything. An assessment measure is a knowledge resource, right? It imparts knowledge to you. A treatment manual is a knowledge resource. It imparts knowledge to you. It tells you what you can do. And they use this term competency questions, which is how you design things. They say the first thing you do is make the list of competency questions, which are what questions will the user need to answer to be able to act in the way they want to act to achieve their goal. And so in our field, competency questions might be like, is my client depressed? Well, I need to design a measure capable of answering that question. What practice should I deliver next? I don't know what I'm supposed to do tomorrow and my client's coming in. What are the steps to behavioral activation? Now I know what to do, but I don't know how to do it, right? So we need a knowledge resource for that. Did I perform that last practice appropriately? I did it, but I'm not sure if I did it right. Is there a resource that can answer that question? Is my client improving? How would I know? What should I compare to? So is there something that can quickly and effectively answer that question? So when we build these use cases, we make these elaborate lists of competency questions. And the competency refers to, is the resource competent to answer the user's question, is the way to think of it. So I put Deborah McGinnis's book in the link also. It's a fantastic book. Even if you don't use all of it, there's pieces in there that are just fantastic. So takeaway number 2, my point here is I'm at 23 minutes already, trying to make it quick. There are best practices. Design is not just like when you're an amateur chef and you go into the kitchen, you think, I'm pretty good. There are real industry standard, long-standing best practices to model scenarios to reflect the complexity of humans and their lives and their contexts. And they allow us to embrace rather than ignore diversity, development, and dynamics. The real world is super complicated, and designing for the real world is a really challenging task. And there are fantastic, excellent best practices for how to do that. We don't use them that often in our field, and we really can take a lot of advantage of that if we want to. Which leads me to my third question. What is our biggest missed opportunity? And I have a one-word answer to this, and I would bet there's 120 or so people on this Zoom meeting, and I would bet no one can guess the one word I'm thinking of, but I could be wrong. And that word is interoperability. If you were thinking that word, good for you. I think that's our biggest missed opportunity. If you're familiar with the FAIR principles of data science, then maybe you're on board with interoperability. What does interoperability mean? Best way for me to explain this is to tell another story. I'm going to talk about my other kid, my older daughter. She works in aerospace, and in the past year, I've had 2 opportunities to tour where she works, which is a factory where they make rockets. And I've even taken one of my colleagues, who I think is on this call right now, to tour that same factory. And we went around and looked at all the different things they were doing, building boosters, and they're building the little capsules that people go in, and the rocket engines and all these different parts. And I was asking a lot of questions to the software team and so forth. What are they doing over here? And people would say, I don't know what they do, but they make this thing, but I don't know exactly what they're doing, right? And what we took away from our tour of the factory was that it takes about 9,000 people working together to build a single rocket that's capable of putting people up into orbit. And they don't all have to know each other. They don't even know each other's names, some of them, many of them. They don't know what the other people are doing, most of them. They just know what their unit's doing. And then there are people who help assemble those units into bigger things. And there are these layers and layers. And it's this massive choreography that comes together that does something that is truly epic and amazing that can't be done by teams of 2 or 3 people. Now, in our field, we have thousands of people working, but we work in small, independent teams of 2 or 3 or 4, building many, many incompatible treatment protocols, none of which will get to the moon, let alone go beyond. And I don't think it's that, we're all working very hard and everybody's very smart. So this is a commentary on the context within which we work. And I spoke about this a few years ago at ABCT. I'll keep saying it. I think the contingencies are set up to get us to work in ways that are less effective than we could be. I'm going to say a little more about this, and I noticed Kelsey Okamura's on here. When we build these protocols, most of them are using minimally adapted versions of the same procedures over and over. And this is a wonderful graph from Kelsey's recent paper. The dotted line shows the number of new practices that have emerged in our field in my lifetime up until 2015. And the dark line, the solid line, is the number of treatment manuals for disruptive behavior that have emerged over that same time. So you can see we're making new manuals. We're not making many new procedures. And that was 10 years ago. This is where we are now. There's over 700 protocols tested in randomized trials for disruptive behavior alone, which is one sliver of the problem we're trying to solve in children's mental health, right? We do the same thing with assessment. We have thousands of measures using mostly the same minimally adapted items. And somehow we're not coming together and putting all of our work together like the way people do in aerospace or the way people do in the movie industry or almost any other industry. We wrote about this 20 years ago, and I'm going to give a shout out to Ken Weingard, who wrote a brilliant paper about instructional design in 2004, 20 years ago, talking about interoperability, talking about putting all of our manuals into Moodle before people were talking about Moodle. It was brilliant. I feel like I've been talking about interoperability for 20 years. I'm going to talk about it until more of us are talking about it because I think it's that important. We wrote that modularity paper to inspire people to put all of their pieces together. And I can't tell you in the last 20 years how many people have come to me and said, I made a new modular manual, and now we have 300 modular manuals that don't work together, which I feel like was a failure on my part to communicate that vision. So I'm just going to keep repeating it in different ways. Maybe the rocket story will work this time. Now, there's one exception, one big exception. There's been a few exceptions, but one big exception. I got to give a shout out to Raj Shafran, whose team added 3 modules to the match program that we developed in 2004. Rather than make a new manual, she wanted to test match in a pediatric epilepsy context in the UK and said, I think if we just add 3 modules to the existing program, it'll work that are related to epilepsy, it'll work in that context. They did this brilliant randomized trial. Sophie Bennett was the first author. It made the cover story of The Lancet, which is the most cited journal in medicine. It was just fantastic. So there's one great exception, and I feel like I'll take any victory we can get on interoperability. So takeaway number 3, I think our field needs better incentives and better infrastructure for us to engage in transformative collaboration. I just saw I'm going to date this whole recording, but I just saw the Deadpool Wolverine movie. There were 3,000 people in the credits to make that movie. It was a pretty good movie, but that's a lot of people working together to make something. We don't do that in our field, and we should be able to do that. So I'm going to end with this vision. Imagine if thousands of us could build into collaborative platforms. We had robust dynamic infrastructure, organizing all the science that we know, findings as they come out, going into that, coming out for users who are consuming that. And it scales out to millions of users in whatever language they need, in whatever format they need, because we have people who work on languages and who work on formats, and ultimately leading at scale to stronger communities and better lives. This is possible, and I want to say it's more than a vision because, as you heard from the introduction, thanks, Brianna, that there was some prototyping of this, and we did double the effect size for all the children in a statewide system with this kind of design. We did 3 RCTs with these designs in 4 distinct regions, outperforming gold standard EBTs. We did the largest implementation and the fastest implementation of a new service in the nation's largest public mental health system. And Adriana Rodriguez published a paper showing 8 years later, it's the only program that had 100% sustainment across all agencies in LA County. So people liked it. People kept using it like smartphones and like wristwatches. 40,000 users in 50 states, 130 countries, 550 trainers, 205 faculty training these models. And I'm really proud to say 300, now it's not 3,000, but 30 treatment developers. If you read Margaret Crane's paper, we are far and away leading, getting at least 30 people to build into a single protocol system called MAP, which I'm very proud of. So anyway, I'm going to leave us with that vision and that hopefully a sense of what can be done. And I'm going to pause at this point because I see I'm at my 30 minutes. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Bruce. Aaron, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it away. Always fun to follow Bruce and to see all the familiar names and faces up here. I mean, just as a quick aside, I'm not sure I would have been thinking about intervention design in the way that I've been able to over, I don't know how many years now, if it hadn't been for Bruce's work. So thanks, Bruce, for kind of leading the way. I really appreciate it and have appreciated sort of learning from you as I've gotten started in this space and gone deep into design in lots of different ways. I think you'll see all sorts of commonalities between what Bruce is talking about and some of what I'm going to be talking about. There's a few places where maybe we've gone deeper into some specifics while always trying to be linked to those bigger picture things that I think Bruce is so good at kind of making sure that we're remembering. And I couldn't agree more with the point that so much of what we do in implementation science, which we all know and love, or at least I know and love, and I think many people on this call know and love, is really, without recognizing it, intended to or needed in order to overcome design problems that we've inadvertently built into some of our best interventions. So does everyone see the kind of slide they would expect to see at the beginning of a talk in a thing like this online? Okay, great. So I'm going to jump into it with just some acknowledgments of different grants. Most of the work that I do is in schools, and most of the funding I get is from either the National Institute of Mental Health or the Institute of Education Sciences, the Department of Education's major research funding arm. The maybe top ones in each of those categories are probably the ones that are most explicitly related to some of the design and redesign work that we're doing, including some usability testing work that I'll be talking about. But first, even though I can't really see many of you, I would like you to raise your hand, even if your camera's off, if you've ever worried that your intervention or implementation strategy wasn't readily scalable beyond your immediate team. I see a few hands from those I can see. I see many virtual hands also. If anyone, a practitioner, an organizational administrator, a research collaborator, has ever suggested that your intervention or implementation strategy was too cumbersome. Yeah, me, I've had that happen a lot. Or if you want to make sure that your intervention or implementation strategy is applicable and accessible across a range of different user groups. Boom. Yeah, absolutely. And that is kind of, these are the problems, these are the common experiences that we're trying to solve both at the UW-Alacrity Center and at the SMART Center. And the reason we're doing this and what we're trying to overcome is, I think, here's one of my quotes that I'll show from Douglas Martin, that the alternative to good design is bad design. It is bad design, not no design at all. There's no such thing as no design. Everyone makes design decisions all the time without realizing it, and unless you're attentive to design. And I think this was, woven through so much of what Bruce was just telling us. You're gonna have a bad time. If you're not thinking about it and you're not deliberate about it and you're not considering who your users are and what they need, you're going to do things like, here's a little bridge between Bruce's talk and mine. You're going to put together a door that needs a sign in order to understand how to use that door, right? When you approach a door and you don't know what you're supposed to do with it, that's a design failure. This is, of course, one of the classic images of problematic design. Here's another one that's increasingly irrelevant, but it's a well-known fact that you have to spin a USB 3 times before it'll fit, right? At least in old USB, they actually fixed this with USB-C, so it's nice to be able to see some progress. But prior to that, we had the up position, the down position, and the superposition, and we all know that USBs remained in the superposition until observed, except in cases of USB tunneling. So sure, this is relevant to a lot of our kind of tangible or digital technologies. But when we step into the world of psychosocial interventions and implementation strategies, which are also complex psychosocial interventions in their own right, we often encounter a lot of different types of design issues. Sometimes we encounter over-design and feature creep, right? The misguided notion that somehow more is always better, that we've designed or optimized interventions for research trials and have often created things that are complicated and infeasible, that often require the replacement rather than the augmentation of existing practices in whatever sort of service setting we're talking about. And we also see under-design, that sometimes we have inflexible interventions. They're inadequately responsive to novel contexts, or at the very least perceived to be. And even that perception is, I would argue, a design issue. And all of this problematic design, probably pretty obviously, limits the scalability of some of our best interventions and some of our best research that people have been, devoting their careers to building and to sort of giving to the world. And that's fantastic that they're doing it, but there's such huge barriers to that having the kind of impact. So many of our colleagues who might be intervention designers and have had very successful careers doing that are really trying to achieve. Obviously, the public health impact of some of our best interventions is limited by their inconsistent application and or implementation science. And what I would argue, and I think this is very consistent with what Bruce was talking about as well, is that our evidence-based psychosocial intervention and implementation strategy design is an underappreciated determinant, to use implementation science speak, sort of barrier or facilitator of adoption and use. The perspective that I've been taking to this is one where we tend to use the term human-centered design, but this is really a slide. I like to kind of refer to this as my, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet slide. It doesn't matter what term you're using. Similar to implementation science, where we have implementation science, knowledge translation, knowledge utilization, scaling science, et cetera, et cetera. We have the same thing going on in the design space, whether we're talking about co-design, human-computer interaction, design thinking, user-centered design, human factors engineering, human-centered design. We're all in orbit around the same concepts and the same types of processes. People might argue to the death about whether one of these is the greater umbrella term under which others are going to fit. I'm not one of those people. I think we're all here in order to make some contributions to creating better things that can solve the problems of people in all sorts of settings. I tend to use the term human-centered design in part because some of my colleagues have been doing that, and that's a lot of the perspective from a certificate program I was fortunate enough to do early on in a career development award at the University of Washington in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. Human-centered design is an approach that grounds product development in information about the people and the settings who are going to use that product, right? This is a fairly straightforward, generic human-centered design framework. You identify a need and plan your human-centered design process. You understand and specify the context of use, specify users and contextual requirements, right? A lot of this you could see reflected in the framework that Bruce was laying out about sort of different components and understanding how an intervention is going to need to be responsive, right? Then you develop your design solutions to meet those requirements, evaluate them, and continue to in order to make sure that your design will ultimately meet your user and contextual requirements. So this is the overarching kind of like generic framework, one way of thinking about it for how design can really be applied to any sort of problem, whether it's in our mental health space, whether it's in implementation or anywhere else. I do want to talk, because I think a lot about implementation science, about human-centered design, and how human-centered design and implementation science can share a lot of common objectives. Both human-centered design and implementation science are ultimately about the adoption of new innovations, iteratively solving real-world problems, considering and trying to incorporate the needs of multiple actors and individual behavior, but they go about it relatively differently. At least historically, I think there's more and more kind of merging and understanding of the different fields and the different kind of contributions. Implementation science typically maintains innovation fidelity above all else, and I would say is maybe overly anchored on fidelity, or at least traditional notions of fidelity. Whereas human-centered design changes the innovation to meet local needs very willingly. Implementation science has strategies that often seek to change the organizational setting. Human-centered design, although there are some exceptions, I would say, in terms of things like service design or systems engineering, is likely to evaluate, but rarely change a particular setting directly. There are exceptions to this, but overall, I would say that those are sort of some unique foci and both contributions that these two fields can make to one another, again, in service of getting innovation out into the real world. When we're talking about targets for design activities within implementation and within mental health services, we laid out in a paper how human-centered design methods can be applied to at least 3 different categories of health services research products. You could also add to this list the systems themselves. We weren't considering that a health services research product in the same way as we would something like an explicit evidence-based psychosocial intervention, a digital technology, wearables, apps, the things that you tend to think of most readily when hearing the words design and human-centered design. That's where my mind goes. That's where most people's mind goes. And that's where the majority of this work has been conducted, both in health and other places. And then implementation strategies, right? Our training processes, our post-training consultation processes, leadership-oriented organizational change strategies. There have been some systematic and narrative reviews in health and education and other sorts of sectors that have demonstrated that these non-digital applications are rare, but they're growing, surrounding ways to consider how you can design what is essentially a complex psychosocial and interpersonal process that can be sort of investigated and improved through some of the same kinds of methods that we might use for a tangible product in the real world, a smartphone, or the apps that it contains. So one thing that I've really been focused on and that the UW Alacrity Center is focused on is the science of intervention adaptation. This is the old CFIR 1.0 figure, but the reason I still show it is because it's so explicit about how there is no implementation without adaptation. Sometimes that can happen prospectively, and if it doesn't happen prospectively and deliberately at the outset of an implementation process, it's just going to happen during that implementation process, and there's nothing we can do about it. We can try to set people up well with interventions that don't need as much adaptation or are responsive to adaptation, but it's going to happen. What we've been doing at the UW Alacrity Center is applying really just a specified version of that generic framework I showed you before. Like there's nothing like extra special or I would argue even that innovative about what I'm showing you right here. But this is a specified version of these kinds of iterative processes that attend to context and users in order to create something that's going to better match their needs. This is not an implementation framework also. I want to be very explicit about that. We have plenty of implementation frameworks. This is an intervention and implementation strategy redesign framework that's currently being applied across, 15 to 20 different UW Alacrity studies, as well as other studies outside of our center, to redesign both interventions and strategies, including those with and without a digital component. But just really briefly, we start with this discover phase, which again, I think was reflected in that generic framework, identifying really things about the users, the setting, and the thing that needs redesign, and doing some initial usability testing of that thing, identifying places where it can be improved and how it can be brought into alignment with the needs of the people and settings who we are expecting to have some degree of interest in adopting it. Then we move into our iterative design build phase, where we're developing prototypes and testing those prototypes at a smaller scale and refining our solutions. And then we move into a test phase. And this test phase is really a smaller scale, usually, sometimes it's a little bit larger scale, but hybrid effectiveness implementation trial, right? Where we're looking at implementation outcomes and some service outcomes. This is our theory of change for our discover, design, build, test process. Just to give you a sense of how we're kind of considering it. This is for, it says 2.0 because this is how we've been conceptualizing it in the sort of renewal second version of the UW Alacrity Center, which was funded or kind of refunded in the renewal by the National Institute of Mental Health last year. The mechanisms that we've identified as being sort of most proximal to the DDBT process are usability, and I'll be talking about that a good amount in just a moment. Engagement, sort of the degree of user participation and enthusiasm for aspects of an intervention or implementation strategy that require user involvement. And appropriateness, the contextual fit, right? Relevance, compatibility for a given practice setting or practitioner. So now I'm going to jump into talking about usability, which is something that we've anchored a lot of our work on at the UW Alacrity Center and also at the Smart Center. Usability is the extent to which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals in a specified context of use. Lots of specification in there. I would argue that usability is a key implementation determinant. Again, in implementation science, we like to talk about determinants because we got so tired of saying barriers and facilitators over and over again. Determinants seem shorter, so we've all adopted that language. But that this is an upstream determinant, and that conversely, implementation outcomes are key proximal effects of good design. And if you have an intervention that is characterized by efficiency, effectiveness, low error rates, that you are more likely to achieve positive perceptual implementation outcomes, positive behavioral implementation outcomes, actual fidelity, perhaps actual reach, ultimate sustainment, and then through that service outcomes. I also want to say that all this is messy, and the extent to which usability is fully distinct from especially some of these perceptual implementation outcomes is an open empirical question that we're trying to address within the Alacrity Center. This is a completely theoretical arrangement of some of these core outcomes that we're interested in the Alacrity Center. We conceptualize usability as being perhaps a bit more context independent and a quality of a particular intervention than some of these other sort of perceptual implementation outcomes. But it remains to be seen whether this actually bears out. And obviously, even if usability is contained within a particular intervention, that usability is only going to manifest itself when it interfaces, when that particular intervention interfaces with individuals in contexts. This is also theoretical, but makes the point that as you move from smaller, more focused, expert use of something into the real world and larger scale use, usability's importance increases with scale. The story I always like to tell is, I live in Seattle, and in the early years of computers, people like Bill Gates, were walking around town here and had the motivation and expertise to work around all the design problems that you had to work around in order to interface with early computers that certainly didn't have the kind of point and click ease of use that we've become accustomed to, and that's only kind of improved from that point forward. In the same way, so many of our interventions were developed in research labs and academic medical centers that begin with expert users. And perhaps they're highly motivated and incredibly skilled graduate students who begin as a completely non-representative, but highly skilled initial user base. But once you move pretty rapidly outside of those kinds of populations of users, you see usability's importance becoming that much more critical. Again, a theoretical relationship. So we do a lot of usability testing, borrowing methods from human-computer interaction and human-centered design in order to test some of our best psychosocial interventions, identify usability issues, and use that as sort of our roadmap for intervention redesign. Here are some best practices for usability testing, including clear identification of your end users, your primary users, your secondary users, who might be people who are going to interact with a particular intervention, but whose needs you can only meet if it doesn't compromise your ability to meet the needs of your primary users. This might be for some intervention in a school. Let's say I do a lot of work in schools, and one primary user could be a teacher that's going to deliver a prevention program. Their administrator in their school building, their principal or assistant principal or someone who sort of oversees and supports them, could be a secondary user where that intervention needs to be accessible to them. But it's going to be most important for that teacher and that primary user, or the co-primary user of the student, to be able to interface effectively with an intervention. Then there's the negative users that are often forgotten in these kinds of design processes, because if you're designing for everyone, you're designing for no one. And sometimes we can create things with different modes that could be responsive to the whole range of users. But it's just as important to consider who you're actively not designing for. Prioritizing components for testing, often, especially our complex interventions, have so many different pieces to them. You can't set up a usability test to address them all, just like you can't test every aspect of the Windows operating system if you were to sit down and do it. That would take 100 years because these are so complex. So you need to prioritize. What do you think is most critical? What's mission critical for the intervention to be able to do what it's supposed to do? And what are the most likely stumbling blocks that people are going to encounter? Testing authentic versus ideal circumstances, making sure that your scenarios that you might be presenting are really reflective of real world use, creating opportunities for users to actually interact with components rather than just asking them what they think about components, get their hands dirty, and to sort of like, whether it's in a role play or something else, to be able to actually spend some time interfacing with an intervention. Tracking success and failure and efficiency in completing specified tasks, and then qualitatively describing the usability issues that users encounter. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. We sort of have a way in the UW Alacrity Center, again, borrowing from the larger HCD literature for how we specify our usability issues across different projects. One other thing I want to say is that focus groups are not usability testing. Focus groups are great, can provide fantastic information about context, about user needs, and things like that. But they're different from usability testing, which should really involve some of these direct interactions and task-based opportunities to see whether these interventions are meeting people's needs. There's a lot of diverse usability evaluation methods out there. This is just sort of a smattering of some of them. And they range from those that are pretty low burden to those that are, considerably time and resource intensive. From quantitative instruments, we have versions of the sort of well-used system usability scale that we've adapted for interventions and implementation strategies. Heuristic evaluation, which is really expert review of how well an innovation aligns with established usability principles. Cognitive walkthroughs, where people aren't necessarily interfacing as directly with an intervention, but are sort of bringing to bear their internal mental models on a particular intervention or implementation strategy. Kind of, I'll call it classic task-based usability testing, where you might go in with scenarios and tasks to complete with a particular intervention, or in vivo testing, like actual deployment, which involves some degree of implementation in order to see whether things are functioning as you would hope they do out in the real world. This is hardly a comprehensive list, but I think can just give a little bit of a sense of the kinds of things that can elicit some of the usability issues that we're most interested in. So what is a usability issue? Aspects of the innovation and/or demand on the user which make it unpleasant, inefficient, onerous, or impossible for the user to achieve their goals. At the Alacrity Center, we specified some components of a usability issue. We have sort of a problem statement from a problem statement, which should be pretty brief. The reader of that problem statement should be able to understand when the problem occurs, for which components of the intervention a problem occurs, for which users the problem occurs, what the problem is, and what its consequences are. We have them specify, and this is our different teams across projects, specify how bad the consequences are. Does it range from catastrophic and dangerous to just sort of like a subtle annoyance? How often does it happen? And complexity, do we understand the cause of this issue or its potential solution, as well as just what evidence, either from the literature or from user testing, supports this usability issue. we've placed a lot of our usability issues into 12 different categories at the Alacrity Center. These are all of like the 75 plus issues that we have received from our different project teams. And I'd encourage anyone who's sort of interested in the concept and at least how we've sort of had the concept play out at the Alacrity Center to take a look at this paper, first authored by my co-director, Sean Munson at the UW Alacrity Center. But there's a few of these things that have sort of emerged as far as themes throughout our usability issues. First, that sometimes we have things that are complex or cognitively overwhelming, right? The intervention or implementation strategy is just sort of too much for the user or interventionist. The time required exceeds time available. This is a little bit different than the classic implementation determinant of time, which is, of course, across all studies and all settings, the #1 barrier that always emerges. This is essentially that there is perhaps the amount of time allowed within a clinical intervention or interaction that simply doesn't allow for all the things that an intervention assumes is going to be achievable within that type of interaction. Incompatibility with interventionist preferences or practices, incompatibility with existing workflows, insufficient customization for clients or recipients, intervention buy-in or value, that the intervention or implementation strategy doesn't sufficiently build client or recipient buy-in for its use, then interventionist buy-in or trust, that it doesn't do that for the person who is going to be tasked with delivering it. Over-reliance on technology, which we see a lot, and we see a lot of defaulting to digital in terms of design solutions also, even after you've identified these usability issues, when sometimes something analog might suffice. But that the intervention itself relies on technology that creates barriers for some service providers or recipients. Sometimes there's another. This might play out in some of our school-based work, where there could be an assumption that there are data systems that are going to inform identification of students for services or tracking or something like that. And in the absence of those, you have an intervention that is making incorrect and problematic assumptions about what the setting can deliver to it. Requires unavailable infrastructure, inadequate scaffolding for the client or recipient, sort of a lack of preparation and support, and that it lacks that support for the client to understand and succeed surrounding required activities for the intervention, inadequate training and scaffolding for the interventionist, and a lack of support for necessary communication, that it requires but doesn't necessarily facilitate communication between an interventionist and a recipient. We've taken all of those usability issues and turned them into proposed design heuristics. I won't necessarily run through all of them right now. I don't know how we're doing on time. We're doing so-so, okay. I know we had extra time. Brianna made the mistake of telling us that we had extra time with Sarah Kate not being able to make it. So like, now the gloves are off. So just to run through a few of these, right? These proposed heuristics, some of which are probably fairly intuitive, I think can be used as a foundation for what good design of interventions can look like. There's probably other ones too, and the field of human-centered design has a lot of different design heuristics out there for different kinds of things. That's sort of a classic way to communicate what principles of effective design are likely to be. Things like low cognitive load, efficient use of time, right? Responsive to existing practices, avoids technology choices that exclude, requires minimal infrastructure, etc. You can see how each of those usability issue categories can then be sort of translated into a proposed design heuristic. Maybe before I wrap up, I just want to run through what I think are a few just example redesign solutions, hardly comprehensive, but things that I've seen out in the literature and in the world that I think that are important design solutions, some of which have been around for a while, all of which have their own cautions, but many of which can be effective ways to create interventions that could be more adoptable and more usable and ultimately more effective. One that you probably know a good amount about is flexible and modularized design driven forward by people like Bruce. And that these kinds of solutions that don't assume linearity, don't assume success with everything that you do, can provide that sort of flexibility that certainly hasn't been present in our classic psychosocial intervention protocols. And it was really learning about like this sort of thinking and this sort of way and various like sort of next generation versions of it that Bruce has been working on that helped me originally to think about the ways that interventions were either well-designed, were inadvertently designed in problematic ways, and where we could really play around a lot with some of the structures and parameters and pieces of our interventions in order to fit some of the constraints that are inevitably going to be present in settings and clinical interactions. Another is digital redesign. People often, like I was saying, default to digital. And digital redesign can improve the scale and accessibility of services for some, while potentially limiting accessibility for others. Intervention technologies tend to suffer from the same kinds of adoption and sustainment problems that more traditional psychosocial interventions do too. So there's always these kinds of trade-offs. At the UW Alacrity Center, we have a lot of projects that sort of make this assumption that they're going to have a digital solution. And we always push those research teams to sort of better specify their rationale for why this is the right solution, and to build in opportunities to test that assumption and to really check rather than just like have a preordained digital solution. We're going to build an app. Okay, maybe like that could be great. That seems like that could increase sort of scalability for some. That might be a great way to do it. But there's all sorts of pitfalls involved in that, both in terms of the production time and how protracted the process of building a digital technology can be. I'm sure anyone who's been involved in a process like that can attest to that. But also ways that it might actually reduce the potency or the relevance of particular intervention processes. And there's actually some interesting work in the space of user burden that demonstrates that sometimes more burdensome processes for things like dietary tracking or things like that can be adopted at greater rates and sustained at greater rates. And I don't know if there's some dissonance coming in or how exactly the sort of what the mechanisms are for those kinds of findings. But in some ways, I think that the jury's out surrounding decreased user burden always being preferable. And then just different kinds of design simplification. A while ago, I was taken with the concept of minimal interventions needed for change, right? That the minimal or lowest level of intervention intensity, expertise, and resources needed to achieve a clinically significant improvement could be a pretty important thing to focus on, especially in settings where we have fewer resources. And really, isn't that all settings? And at least if we're talking about the resource of time. So lots of different ways to think about design simplification. Brief interventions. A colleague of mine, Eric Bruns and Elizabeth McCauley, have been working on a brief intervention for school clinicians for a long time. Very brief interventions. Jessica Schleider and other people have been talking about single session interventions for a while that I think many people have been very taken with. Low and middle income country inspired simplifications. So many fascinating things have grown out of the global health space out of necessity. And we continue to have, I think, a lot of opportunities to kind of to learn from some of those processes where you just simply couldn't have done it otherwise. This image is from a project where they were really simplifying a basic kind of CBT process in order to make it accessible for delivery by people, for delivery to people with low rates of literacy. This is from a project that Deb Kaysen did a good number of years ago. But really this type of like manual simplification has already been applied domestically as well. So I'm going to stop there because I think that's the amount of time that I should be talking for. And I think we're moving on to the next discussion part of our show today.
Thanks so much, Aaron. That was great. And thanks to you and Bruce for your quick redesign of this panel. So those were really informative presentations, and I don't want to hog too much of the time because I do want to leave some time for audience questions. And just for the audience to know, during this period, feel free to put your questions in the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand, you can do that using the raise hand function in Zoom. Just know that we are recording the event. So if you don't want to be recorded and have your face online, you can put your question in the chat and I can read it out loud. I'm going to try to distill. I wrote like 20 questions down while you were all talking. And so I'm gonna choose my top 3. Maybe I'll start with Bruce. So this beautiful coordinated interoperable future that you envisioned was really exciting. And I guess I'm curious if you could just speak a little bit further about what role you think clinical psychological scientists should play in that. You talked about individuals making knowledge resources, the orange boxes, and then you also talked about a role for a coordinator, and for there to actually be the sort of director of the movie kind of analog. And I guess I'm sort of curious about sort of what you see the role of clinical psychological science, and then also, how big or how small the scope of those knowledge resources should be. It's just something that also sort of came up as you were talking.
Okay, I have a 13-minute answer, so we have 13 minutes left. It's a big question. It's a great question. It's a big question. Gosh, I have so many thoughts about this, and the what should we be doing is a good one. I get back to that, like we have the wrong incentives and infrastructure in our field. Like we're building too many interventions, and we're not working together in a way that reuses what we have and that actually traces the provenance of where did things come from and who's actually innovating versus simply repainting something we already have. So I think the field needs to have a serious conversation about the fact that we are producing way, way, way too much in the way of resources. I love it. Aaron, your talk was fantastic. I got to push back on the issue of simplicity. I think that there's a danger and a risk of us creating tens of thousands of simple things that en masse are not simple, because now we have, and I see Geo's on here, how big that mental health app space is. Figuring out what to use when is the hard part that no one's designing. And so to me, it's a series of conversations about what can we learn from industries who have solved this problem. Like, that's why I bring up the rocket story. That's why I bring up the movie industry. But most industries have figured out ways to create roles for collaboration that don't involve, like, you grow the corn, you put the corn in your truck, you sell the corn at the end of your driveway at a farm stand. Like, that's how we operate in our field. And no matter how much we redesign that, it's not going to be industrial scale. And so we need to talk about that as a field. We need to get people outside of clinical science talking to us. I know Margaret Crane's in the audience as well. Like, her paper, I showed it in the talk, like how we look at industry partners who do scale will tell you a lot about what it takes to go to 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 users beyond your clinical trial that might have 10 therapists in it. One other thing I want to raise, I don't even know if this is answering your question, but I'm getting old and I feel like I've been saying the same thing for so long. And I really care about this children's mental health crisis that's been around since the 70s. If you go back and read history, we've got to do better. And there are just some orthodoxies that I think hold us back. And so, like, I worry, like Aaron gave great examples of how to design and redesign. I worry that the thing we're redesigning is not the thing we need to solve this problem. And it shows up in our speech so often. I'm going to point it out, which is, how often do we say, I have an intervention I want to implement? All the time you hear that. Now, if I held up a cookbook and said, this is a meal, you'd think I was nuts. If I held up a script and said, this is a movie you want to watch, you'd say, that's not a movie, that's the script. And the intervention manual is just a cookbook. It's just a movie script. It's a stimulus that creates the intervention. The intervention is a youth and family and a provider interacting together. And that's what we're trying to make happen. That's where the magic is. And we talk about our little things as the interventions. We're creating stimuli to create these interactions between people to be therapeutic. And I think we just need to rethink that entire, like manuals are so baked into our thinking as the thing. And I think if we can't get away from thinking that way, we are never getting to the moon as a field. We have to think about designing ways where we all interact with each other and with machines to be therapeutic to one another and to ourselves so we live better lives. Like that is the problem we're trying to solve. And somehow 25 years ago, we got hooked on the idea that manuals are interventions. And so we have to improve them because people don't like them. That's not the problem we need to solve. We need to know, how do we use science to know how we interact with ourselves and each other to live better lives? That might not involve manuals at all. Or they may be way up the chain at the knowledge creation stage, but they have nothing to do with implementation. And so I know I sound like, emphatic here, but I feel like if we don't go past that orthodoxy, our field will continue to create stuff that nobody uses. And implementation scientists will be very busy trying to figure out why. But so that's my short answer is we need to think, what is the thing we're implementing? What is the thing we're trying to do by designing better?
Erin, do you have thoughts before we move on to some of the questions in the chat?
I mean, I totally, again, I'm not sure if it answers your question, but just sort of in response to some of the things that Bruce was raising, I couldn't agree more. I mean, both related to the kind of simplicity doctrine, which is kind of rampant in the human-centered design space, but there's also kind of people pushing back on it and recognizing that, sometimes more burden is an effective way to actually change behavior. We don't necessarily want things that are always so easy to use, including to make sure that they're efficacious, right? I mean, a very easy example is a trauma narrative that no one likes, and certainly isn't necessarily easy and is not low burden, but we believe, at least sort of theoretically and based on empirical work surrounding exposure interventions, is critical, right? And there might be ways to sort of tweak it, but there's not going to be a way to make it not burdensome. And if it's not burdensome, it's also probably not going to be effective. So I do think there's a lot of important things to think about there, and to not necessarily over anchor on simplicity among the sort of range of different types of design solutions that are out there when trying to figure out how to put something together. And I could not agree more with Bruce's comment about manuals are not interventions. This is something that we frequently need to work with our different teams that we might fund at the Alacrity Center when that sort of, I'll say, manual-centric thinking kind of emerges when redesigning an intervention. It's like, well, we're going to be redesigning the manual. It's like, maybe the manual will change, maybe it won't. But what the manual reflects is a certain way to approach an interpersonal interaction. And the more that you can test that interpersonal interaction, I mean, the manual might provide a little guide for it, and there might be some places where you test the manual, which I would just consider an artifact, which is one component of an intervention, right? There's the actual practice elements, there's the way the practice elements are arranged or decision-making processes surrounding those, there's the artifacts that might sort of support pieces of those, and then there's these sort of sometimes unspoken parameters in terms of delivery modality and timing and number of sessions and things like that are also built in to an intervention. And we try to lay out those sort of different components of something and recognize that all of them could be fair game for testing and redesign. And the ways you sort of codify that might wind up being reflected in the manual as well as other kinds of things. So 100%.
Thanks, Erin. We have sort of 4 minutes left, so maybe we could have a kind of rapid fire, just one question maybe. So there's a question in the chat around sort of how we could make implementation science produce more usable knowledge. And then another around community participatory research and sort of how that can be useful. So maybe whoever wants to speak to sort of like briefly touch on those two things and how those are important in sort of design.
One thing I'll say really quick is we originally started kind of down the path with the UW Alacrity Center, talking more explicitly about CVPR. And then we pulled back from that because we felt that we weren't sort of in a position to be able to fully do that justice. Human-centered design processes are participatory, but I would say do not necessarily go far enough to kind of full power sharing that I would need in order to feel comfortable applying a term like CVPR to that work directly. I think there are sort of examples, both of course in implementation science and in human-centered design, where people really do take a CVPR kind of approach and do that justice. We opted not to borrow, apply that language once we kind of had a full appreciation for what was going to be feasible in the processes that we were laying out in our center, which again are as participatory as we can possibly make them, are very user-oriented. But sometimes there is, I would say within the various design spaces that I'm most familiar with, not always, but often, a power differential that just needs to be acknowledged, where there are some decision makers that are maybe that hopefully have on a redesign team representation from different types of users, but those power differentials are there and I think are present in a lot of design processes and spaces and teams, sometimes more problematically, sometimes less problematically. I mean, if you look around at sort of who is most prominent in the design space, it's often people that look like me, cisgendered white male, making decisions and identifying sort of community needs and trying to be responsive in different kinds of ways, which anyway, didn't totally say CVPR to me.
Thanks so much.
I'll say real quick to that in the 2 minutes. Anyone who interacts with a child is a potential user, and we need to understand them. A parent, a teacher, a coach, a bus driver, a therapist. Anybody can be therapeutic, and that's who we're designing for. And I think if we have an empirical approach to things, we want to say we should be able to summarize everything that's known in human history about how to make children's lives better and whisper it to those users at the moment they need to know. Like that's the vision. And we're very close to being able to do that. The semantic web things that are happening will allow us to harmonize all science, probably in the career spans of several of the younger people on this call. And the language models to do the whispering are already there. They're just not smart yet because we haven't solved the semantic side of things. But we should be thinking about developing a world where, imagine if somebody read every single study and knew everything. What would they tell you to do in any moment when you're around a child who needs guidance or help? Those are the technologies we need to be thinking about building. And it's going to take thousands of us working together to do that. And we need to understand all the different users, and we need to talk to industry about how that works. So that would be my answer to that. Like, implementation science really needs to rethink, what is it that it's implementing? I think it's implementing knowledge, not interventions. That's what it should be, implementing knowledge.
Well, thank you, Bruce. That's a great note to end on, which is sort of how do we move the field forward? So I just want to give a kind of a virtual round of applause to Bruce and Erin. Thank you both so much. This was such a great panel. We're so lucky to have you both.